In 1933, while Britain was still reeling from the Great Depression and Adolf Hitler was rising to power in Germany, a young entrepreneur named George Hollingbury opened a small radio repair shop on Hull Road in York. He called it Comet Radio Company, and with just a few pounds in his pocket and a passion for the emerging world of electronics, he began what would become Britain's first major electrical retailer. Hollingbury had spotted an opportunity that others missed. Ordinary families were beginning to embrace new electrical appliances, but there was nowhere dedicated to buying and servicing them. His tiny shop, measuring just 400 square feet, specialized in radio repairs and sales at a time when wireless sets were becoming the entertainment center of British homes. What started as a one-man operation would eventually grow into a retail empire with over 240 stores across the UK, becoming so synonymous with electrical retail that generations of Britons would say they were going to Comet the way Americans might say they were going to Best Buy. Yet this pioneer of British retail, which survived the Blitz, weathered multiple recessions, and dominated the electrical goods market for decades, would ultimately be felled not by bombs or economic downturns, but by the very technology revolution it had helped bring to British homes. The early years of Comet were defined by Hollingbury's keen understanding that electrical goods needed more than just sales. They needed service. In an era when a radio cost the equivalent of several weeks' wages for an average worker, customers expected their purchases to last for years, and when something went wrong, they needed expert repair. Hollingbury built his reputation on reliability and technical expertise, personally repairing every radio that came through his doors and offering guarantees that competitors couldn't match. By 1938, Comet had expanded to its first proper retail location, a larger shop that showcased the latest in electrical innovation. Television sets were beginning to appear, though they remained luxury items for the wealthy. The company's timing seemed perfect as Britain entered what historians would later call the electrical age, with more homes gaining access to mains electricity and families eager to embrace labor-saving devices. But then came September 1939 and the declaration of war against Germany, which would test the young company's resilience in ways Hollingbury never imagined. Production of consumer electronics virtually ceased as factories switched to military equipment, and luxury purchases became impossible for families focused on survival. Yet Comet adapted, focusing on repairs and maintenance of existing equipment, keeping British families connected to vital wartime broadcasts from the BBC. The war years proved that Comet was built to last, as the company not only survived but thrived by becoming essential to the community. When German bombers targeted York in 1942, damaging buildings throughout the city including areas near Comet's shop, Hollingbury refused to close, instead operating from temporary premises to ensure local families could still get their radios repaired, their lifeline to news from the front lines where their sons and husbands were fighting. The company's workshop became a gathering place where neighbors would bring damaged equipment and share news, creating a sense of community that would become central to Comet's identity for decades. Hollingbury also demonstrated remarkable business acumen during these lean years, using the time to plan for the post-war boom he was certain would come. He studied American retail models, particularly the emerging concept of self-service shopping and competitive pricing that was revolutionizing commerce across the Atlantic. By 1945, as victory celebrations filled British streets, Comet was perfectly positioned for the consumer explosion that followed, with plans for expansion, a network of supplier relationships, and a reputation for service that money couldn't buy. The post-war years saw unprecedented demand for electrical goods as families sought to replace old equipment and embrace new technologies that promised to make life easier after years of hardship and rationing. The 1950s marked Comet's transformation from a local repair shop into a regional retail force as Hollingbury opened new stores across Yorkshire and began developing the retail philosophy that would define the company for the next half-century. His revolutionary approach was built on three pillars: competitive pricing through direct relationships with manufacturers, extensive product ranges that gave customers choice, and after-sales service that ensured customer loyalty. Comet became the first electrical retailer in Britain to offer installment plans, recognizing that working families needed time to pay for expensive items like washing machines and television sets. The company's shops were designed as electrical wonderlands where customers could see the latest innovations demonstrated by knowledgeable staff who understood the technology they were selling. By 1955, Comet had opened its flagship store in Leeds, a 10,000-square-foot showcase that featured Britain's first electrical goods demonstration theater, where customers could watch presentations on new products every hour. The store became a destination, drawing visitors from across Yorkshire who had never seen such a concentration of modern electrical marvels in one place. Television sets, which had been curiosities before the war, were becoming essential household items as the BBC expanded its programming and commercial television launched in 1955. Comet positioned itself as the expert guide to this new world of electronic entertainment, with staff trained not just to sell products, but to educate customers about proper use, maintenance, and the rapidly evolving technology. The 1960s brought the swinging 60s cultural revolution, and with it, an explosion in consumer electronics that played perfectly into Comet's expanding ambitions. Harold Wilson's Labour government promised a Britain forged in the white heat of technology, and families embraced everything from stereo systems to electric kettles with an enthusiasm that made electrical retailers the new kings of the high street. Comet expanded aggressively, opening stores throughout England and establishing the supply chain relationships that would become its greatest competitive advantage. George Hollingberry, now in his 50s, proved to be as innovative in business strategy as he had been in customer service, developing one of Britain's first computerized inventory systems and establishing direct purchasing agreements with major manufacturers like Philips, Hotpoint, and the emerging Japanese companies like Sony that were beginning to challenge European supremacy in electronics. The company's advertising campaigns, featuring the memorable slogan, "Comet, the electrical discount store," positioned the brand as both affordable and authoritative, a combination that resonated with Britain's growing middle class. By 1968, Comet operated 42 stores and had become the largest electrical retailer in northern England, with annual revenues exceeding $10 million. The company went public that year, with shares oversubscribed by 400%, as investors recognized they were buying into not just a successful retailer, but a business that understood the future of British consumer culture. The money raised from the public offering funded even more aggressive expansion, with Comet setting its sights on becoming a national chain that could compete with traditional department stores and emerging discount retailers. The 1970s and early 1980s represented Comet's golden age as the company achieved true national coverage and became as much a part of British consumer culture as Marks & Spencer or Woolworths. Under George Hollingberry's continued leadership and later his carefully chosen successors, Comet perfected the art of electrical retail through innovations that competitors struggled to match. The company pioneered the concept of electrical superstores, vast warehouse-style buildings on the edges of towns where customers could browse thousands of products, compare features and prices, and take advantage of competitive financing options. These stores, typically 15,000 to 25,000 square feet, were revolutionary in British retail, offering selection and convenience that smaller electrical shops simply couldn't provide. Comet's buyers developed legendary relationships with manufacturers, securing exclusive products and negotiating prices that allowed the company to offer genuine discounts while maintaining healthy margins. The rise of home computing in the early 1980s proved to be another watershed moment, as Comet became one of the primary retailers for the Sinclair ZX80, BBC Micro, and other computers that introduced British families to the digital age. The company's technical expertise, developed over decades of selling and servicing complex electrical goods, translated perfectly to the computer market, where customers needed education and support as much as competitive prices. By 1984, Comet operated 178 stores across Britain and employed over 6,000 people, with revenues exceeding £400 million annually. The company had achieved something remarkable. It had become both a household name and a genuinely respected retailer, known for fair dealing, product knowledge, and customer service that created loyalty across generations of British families. The late 1980s and 1990s brought new challenges as the retail landscape became increasingly competitive and complex. But Comet initially adapted with the same innovation that had driven its earlier success. The company embraced the concept of retail parks and out-of-town shopping, opening even larger superstores that offered not just electrical goods, but furniture, kitchen design services, and extended warranties that became significant profit centers. Comet's marketing became more sophisticated, with television advertising campaigns that featured celebrities and positioned the brand as both trustworthy and trendy. The company was among the first electrical retailers to recognize the potential of mobile phones, establishing dedicated phone shops within larger stores and developing expertise in the increasingly complex world of telecommunications. When the internet emerged in the mid-1990s, Comet was quick to establish an online presence, launching one of Britain's first electrical retail websites in 1997 and offering customers the ability to research products online and purchase either for home delivery or store pickup. The company's financial performance remained strong throughout this period, with revenues reaching nearly $2 billion by 1999 and profit margins that were the envy of the retail industry. Yet beneath the surface, fundamental changes were reshaping the retail world that would prove far more threatening to Comet's business model than any previous challenge. The rise of international retail chains, the increasing sophistication of supply chain management, and the growing power of internet-based retailers were creating a new competitive environment where Comet's traditional advantages were becoming less relevant. The beginning of the end for Comet can be traced to the early 2000s, when a series of ownership changes, strategic missteps, and the emergence of new competitive threats began to erode the foundations that George Hollingberry had built 7 decades earlier. In 2003, the company was acquired by Kisa Electricals, a European retail conglomerate that promised investment and international expertise, but instead brought bureaucracy and a loss of focus on customer service. The new owners were more interested in financial engineering than retail innovation, cutting costs in areas like staff training and customer service that had been central to Comet's success for generations. At the same time, the retail landscape was being revolutionized by companies like Amazon, which launched its UK operations in 1998 and gradually expanded from books to electronics, offering selection and convenience that traditional retailers struggled to match. Amazon's model was fundamentally different from Comet's. Instead of relying on physical stores and personal service, it used sophisticated logistics, competitive pricing, and customer reviews to create a shopping experience that was available 24 hours a day from anywhere with an internet connection. The online giant's ability to operate with lower overhead costs, maintain virtually unlimited inventory through third-party sellers, and use data analytics to personalize the shopping experience represented a paradigm shift that traditional retailers like Comet were unprepared to counter. Other competitors were also emerging. Currys and PC World merged to create a more formidable rival, while supermarket chains like Tesco began selling electrical goods at prices that undercut specialist retailers. The iPhone launch in 2007 accelerated the transformation of how people researched and purchased electronics, with customers increasingly using mobile devices to compare prices, read reviews, and make purchases online rather than visiting physical stores. By 2008, Comet was clearly struggling to adapt to the new reality of electrical retail, despite attempts to modernize its operations and compete more effectively with online rivals. The global financial crisis hit the company particularly hard as customers delayed major purchases and became more price-sensitive, favoring online retailers that offered the lowest prices over traditional stores that provided personal service. Comet's costs were simply too high to compete effectively. The company operated 240 stores across Britain, employed thousands of staff, and maintained extensive service operations that had been competitive advantages in earlier decades but were now seen as expensive overhead. The rise of online shopping meant that customers no longer needed to visit physical stores to compare products or get technical advice. They could read reviews, watch demonstration videos, and make informed decisions from their homes. Amazon's recommendation engine, customer reviews, and next-day delivery options provided a shopping experience that was often superior to visiting a physical store, particularly for customers who already knew what they wanted to buy. In 2011, Kisa Electricals sold Comet to Op Capita, a private equity firm, for the nominal sum of $2, along with a $50 million payment to cover the company's pension obligations. A clear signal that even the previous owners recognized the business was in terminal decline. Op Capita promised a turnaround plan that included store closures, staff reductions, and a greater focus on online sales, but these efforts proved too little, too late. The company's suppliers became increasingly nervous about Comet's financial stability, demanding faster payment terms and reducing credit lines, which created a cash flow crisis that made recovery virtually impossible. On November 14, 2012, administrators were called in to wind down operations, and Britain's first electrical retailer began its final closing down sale. The collapse of Comet marked the end of an era in British retail, as thousands of employees lost their jobs just weeks before Christmas, and customers holding service contracts or warranty agreements found themselves without recourse. The company's 240 stores, many of which had been fixtures in British town centers and retail parks for decades, closed permanently, with fixtures and fittings sold to competitors and property leases terminated. The human cost was enormous. Nearly 7,000 employees were made redundant, many of them long-serving staff who had built their careers around the technical expertise and customer service principles that George Hollingbury had established. Suppliers were left with millions of pounds in unpaid invoices, while customers discovered that extended warranties and service agreements were worthless. The Comet brand, once synonymous with electrical retail in Britain, disappeared from the high street after 79 years of continuous operation. Yet the company's demise was more than just another retail failure. It represented the victory of a fundamentally different approach to commerce that prioritized convenience and price over personal service and technical expertise. Amazon and other online retailers had demonstrated that customers were willing to sacrifice the traditional retail experience for lower prices, greater selection, and the convenience of shopping from home. The rise of smartphones meant that customers could research products, compare prices, and read reviews while standing in Comet stores, then purchase online for less money and often faster delivery. The very technology that Comet had spent decades bringing to British homes, computers, internet connections, and mobile devices, had ultimately made its business model obsolete. The irony was not lost on retail analysts. Britain's first electrical retailer, which had survived wartime bombing and decades of economic turbulence, had been defeated by the electronic revolution it had helped to create. The story of Comet's rise and fall offers profound lessons about the nature of business disruption and the challenges facing traditional retailers in the digital age. For nearly 8 decades, Comet had built its success on principles that seemed unshakable: customer service, technical expertise, product demonstration, and after-sales support. These advantages had allowed the company to survive and thrive through multiple challenges, from world wars to recessions to changing consumer preferences. Yet the internet and e-commerce represented a different kind of disruption, one that fundamentally altered customer expectations and made traditional retail advantages irrelevant. Amazon didn't just offer lower prices. It created a new paradigm where customers expected unlimited selection, detailed product information, user reviews, and convenient delivery options that physical stores simply couldn't match. The speed of this transformation caught many traditional retailers off guard, but it was particularly devastating for companies like Comet that had high fixed costs and business models built around physical locations. The company's attempts to compete online were hampered by legacy costs and operational complexity that pure-play internet retailers didn't face. Perhaps most significantly, Comet's failure demonstrated that brand loyalty and customer relationships, while valuable, were not sufficient to overcome fundamental competitive disadvantages in pricing and convenience. The British consumers who had shopped at Comet for generations ultimately chose lower prices and greater convenience over personal relationships and technical expertise. The company that had pioneered electrical retail in Britain, survived the Blitz, and brought technology to millions of homes had become a casualty of the very digital revolution it had helped to enable, proving that in business, even the most successful companies must continuously evolve or risk being swept away by forces they helped to create.